The photograph should have been nothing more than a relic, a frozen moment from 1941, its edges worn, its surface cracked by time. Yet the moment I held it, a coldness slid over my skin like a warning. 6 faces stared back at me, the Hartley family, gathered stiffly in front of a curtain of towering pines. Their expressions were unsettling, as if they had been interrupted mid-fear, their smiles forced, their eyes fixed on something behind the camera. Or perhaps behind them. At first glance, it was an ordinary family portrait. But the longer I studied it, the more wrong it felt. There was something in the trees, a shape blurred by motion or by intention. A smear of darkness that looked almost aware. I tried to dismiss it as a flaw in the aging film, yet my instincts tugged with the insistence of something ancient and familiar, something the woods themselves had tried to bury. The Hartleys disappeared the same week this photograph was taken. No explanation. No bodies. No search that uncovered even a scrap of clothing. Just the abrupt vanishing of 6 people who had sat stiffly for a camera moments before something tore them from the world. I didn't know this when I first found the photo. I learned it hours later, buried in brittle newspaper clippings and forgotten police reports. But by then, the chilling truth had already begun to coil around me. Because when I looked at the photo again, the smear in the woods was no longer a blur. It had sharpened, just a little, into a shape that hadn't been there before. A 7th figure, half hidden by the pines, watching the Hartleys with a stillness that didn't belong to any living thing. And as the light in my room flickered, I felt an impossible certainty settle over me. Whatever had been in those woods in 1941 had not stayed there. The discovery of the 1941 photo began as nothing more than a routine task for the historian, a quiet afternoon spent sifting through forgotten boxes of undeveloped film tucked away in the back room of an estate sale. Dust clung to every surface, and most of the negatives were too damaged to save, but the historian had a habit of examining each one with patience. When the strip labeled Hartley, 1941 surfaced, it seemed unremarkable, a simple family name, a year that carried no immediate significance. Still, something about the handwriting on the label felt urgent, as if the person who wrote it had been in a hurry or under some sort of strain. The historian ran the film through a delicate restoration process, adjusting exposure, stabilizing the contrast, and coaxing the fading image back into existence. What slowly emerged on the screen was both ordinary and unsettling in ways that did not immediately register. 6 people stood rigidly in the frame, a father, a mother, and 4 children, each spaced just slightly further apart than most families stood for portraits. Their clothes matched the era, their postures formal, but their faces held an expression the historian couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it wasn't ease either. It was as though each one had been caught anticipating something they couldn't name. The more the historian zoomed in, the stranger the image became. The youngest child's eyes were not looking at the camera but just past it, as though someone or something had brushed their attention at the exact moment the shutter clicked. The mother's fingers were curled tightly around her daughter's shoulder, the pressure visible even through the grainy film. And then there were the shadows. Behind the family, dense trees lined the background, tall and imposing, but the darkness between the trunks didn't behave like natural shade. It pooled too heavily near the ground, stretched too far up the bark, and suggested the faint outline of a figure that was either distorted by motion or never meant to be seen. The historian dismissed it at first, attributing the shape to film degradation or perhaps a flaw from the developing process, but something tugged at their attention with a persistence that bordered on instinct. They leaned closer, studying the faint smear in the background, noticing how it seemed almost upright, almost symmetrical, almost aware. What made the moment truly unnerving was not what the historian saw, but what they felt. A sensation like a quiet pressure in the room, a subtle weight behind their shoulders, as though the photo itself had shifted the air. They couldn't explain the unease, only that it didn't come from the family. It came from the space behind them, from the shadow that did not belong to the era, the camera, or the forest. Something about the image resisted being forgotten, and as the historian adjusted the last settings on the screen, they knew with an inexplicable certainty that this was no ordinary photograph and that the moment captured in 1941 had never truly ended. The forest behind the Hartley family in the photograph held a presence that grew more unsettling with every passing moment the historian studied it. At first, it seemed merely a backdrop, tall pines rising in uniform rows behind the stiffly posed family, their needles forming a dark curtain that framed the image. But as the historian adjusted the brightness and contrast, the shapes within the trees began to suggest something more than just foliage. There was a subtle irregularity in the shadows, a disturbance that could not be explained by sun angles or camera flaws. A faint blur lingered in the distance, a shape almost human in form but indistinct, its edges wavering as if the film itself had tried to reject its presence. The historian leaned closer, their eyes tracing the blur, trying to convince themselves that it was merely a trick of light, a smudge on the negative, or perhaps a branch caught mid-motion. But the longer they stared, the less plausible those explanations became. The figure seemed impossibly deliberate, almost aware, yet just beyond the clarity of the photograph. It was in that vague form that the unease began to take root, a subtle vibration beneath the skin, like the faint hum of a presence that should not exist. The historian compared the shape against the known dimensions of the forest in the background, realizing that it was far too tall to be a child, too narrow to be a tree, yet impossibly still to be any living animal. A chill ran down their spine as the edges of the blur seemed to shift when they blinked, a sensation that suggested movement even though the image was static. For the first time, the photograph ceased to be just a record of a family and became a window into something else, something hidden among the pines, something that had watched the Hartleys as the shutter closed on that fateful day. Curiosity overcame the initial fear, and the historian began searching for other photographs from the same roll, hoping for context, for a clue that might explain the strange presence. But the rest of the negatives were unremarkable, ordinary snapshots of the family posed in their home or garden, with nothing to suggest an ominous presence. Only this one photograph contained the forest, and only in it did the blur linger. As they returned to the image, the historian noticed small details previously overlooked, the subtle tilt of the trees around the figure, the way the shadows pooled unnaturally at its feet, the faint suggestion of an arm-like shape extending from the blur toward the family. Each observation deepened the sense of dread, a growing awareness that the photograph had captured not merely the Hartley's likeness but a fragment of something far darker. The historian felt the weight of the forest pressing through the image, a silent accusation, a warning that the woods behind the family were not empty and that the presence within them had been there long before the camera clicked and had not yet left. The more the historian dug into the Hartley family, the more the story of their disappearance took on an impossible weight. Public records offered little, only the usual dates of birth, marriage certificates, and the faint traces of census entries that confirmed the family had lived on the outskirts of a small, densely wooded town. Local newspapers from 1941, yellowed and brittle with age, held fleeting mentions of the Hartleys' articles that seemed ordinary at first, reporting nothing more than the family's day-to-day existence. Then, in a mid-June edition, an odd notice appeared. The entire family was listed as missing. The wording was peculiar, almost clinical, detailing that 6 people had vanished from their home within the span of a single week. The article noted that neighbors reported no unusual activity, no screams, no visitors, and no evidence of a struggle. It was as though the family had simply ceased to exist, evaporating into the dense woods that surrounded their property. The historian became obsessed with the timing. The photo had been taken just days before the family disappeared. In it, the Hartleys were alive, posed, aware of the camera, yet already caught in an invisible tension. The sense of anticipation in their faces now made unbearable sense. Something had been looming over them, something that had followed them home from the forest, something that had marked the moment they posed and then claimed them entirely. Investigating further, the historian found scattered accounts from neighbors who recalled seeing the family in passing, but those memories were inconsistent and strangely vague. Some described the Hartleys as appearing on edge, while others remembered an unnatural stillness about them. No one could pinpoint a day of final sighting, only the eerie conclusion that they had all vanished without trace. Even police files offered no clarity. Reports from the time were sketchy, limited, and strangely circumspect. Officers had been dispatched to the Hartley residence multiple times after neighbors reported seeing shadows moving in the windows or hearing faint cries in the night. Yet the records noted nothing beyond routine inquiries. Investigators at the time commented that the house appeared entirely normal, except for a growing unease they could not quantify. No evidence of foul play was ever recorded, no footprints outside, no signs of forced entry, nothing that would indicate why or how 6 individuals could disappear so completely. Families in the town whispered of strange occurrences, objects moved inexplicably, doors left open that had been locked, but these were dismissed as rumors, the sort of hushed gossip that accompanies tragedy. The absence of physical evidence became more troubling than the disappearance itself. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the Hartleys were officially presumed dead, yet without bodies, the presumption was fragile, almost meaningless. The historian realized that the photograph might hold the only tangible connection to the family that had vanished. The faces frozen in that frame were no longer merely images, they were the last known proof of lives that had been erased. And lurking behind them, in the forest, the shape in the shadows hinted at the reason why the Hartleys had disappeared so completely, as if the woods had conspired to swallow them whole. The photographer's diary was discovered in a dusty attic, tucked between stacks of ledgers and old receipts, its leather cover cracked and brittle with age. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the words carried a weight that sent a chill through the historian as they read. The photographer had recorded the Hartley family session in meticulous detail, noting the lighting, the positioning of each person, and the subtle expressions he hoped to capture. At first, the diary seemed routine, the careful observations of an artist intent on producing the perfect image. But as the entries progressed, a growing tension became apparent, a nervousness that had seeped into the descriptions of the family and the surrounding forest. He wrote of a watchful stillness in the woods, a sensation that something unseen was observing the session. The notation was brief, almost casual, as if the writer tried to ignore the creeping fear that filled the air around him, yet the unease bled into every line. The most haunting entry described the moment the shutter clicked on the final frame. The photographer mentioned a whisper, faint and indecipherable, carried on the wind through the pines behind the family. He could not tell whether it was a fragment of speech, a sigh, or the sound of some animal, yet it had frozen him in place, a sudden paralysis that left his hands trembling on the camera. He admitted in the diary that he felt eyes on him, not the eyes of the Hartleys, but something else, something that had emerged from the shadows of the forest and lingered just beyond his comprehension. That entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, the ink smudged in a way that suggested a hasty departure, and the following pages contained nothing but a series of scattered, illegible marks, as though he had been too afraid to continue writing. Cross-referencing the diary with local accounts, the historian realized the photographer had vanished shortly after the session, leaving the negatives undeveloped for decades. No one had seen him again in town, and there were no reports of his whereabouts. His sudden disappearance was never explained, and the diary became the only record of what had occurred that day. The historian felt the weight of it, the understanding that the photographer's fear was genuine, rooted in something beyond logic or reason. He had seen, or at least sensed, whatever had lingered in the trees, and that encounter had driven him from his craft and from his life. The more the historian read, the clearer it became that the diary was not merely a record of a photography session but a warning. Every detail, every hesitation in the writing, every smudge and abrupt ending, pointed to the presence that had been stalking the Hartleys and that had been aware of the photographer's intrusion. The whispers in the trees, the shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind, and the urgency of the final entry combined into an unmistakable message. The camera had captured more than a family portrait, and the photographer had fled because he had glimpsed something no human was meant to see. The discovery of a second version of the Hartley family photograph was accidental, found buried beneath a stack of mislabeled negatives in the corner of a forgotten archive. At first glance, it seemed nearly identical to the first image. The same rigid poses, the same small family standing against the backdrop of dense pines, the same awkward stiffness in their expressions. But as the historian examined it more closely, the difference became impossible to ignore. There were 7 figures in this image, not 6. The extra figure was barely distinguishable, cloaked in shadow near the edge of the frame, half obscured by the trees. Its presence was subtle, almost like a trick of the light, yet unmistakably human in form. The historian felt a sudden tightening in their chest, a cold ripple of disbelief. How could this exist? The Hartley family, according to every record, consisted of only 6 members, and all had disappeared the week the photograph was taken. The figure was small, indistinct, and oddly still, standing a step behind the rest of the family, its face turned slightly away from the camera. It was impossible to discern its age or identity, and yet, there was something in its posture that suggested awareness, an almost predatory patience. The historian pored over the negative, magnifying every detail, yet the image refused to clarify, offering only hints: the slightest curve of an arm, the faint outline of a head, the way the shadows wrapped around it unnaturally. It was as if the seventh figure had been deliberately included but remained hidden from plain sight, a ghostly presence tethered to the family yet separate from them. The existence of this second photo threw the historian into a deeper investigation. They compared it against the first, overlaying images, adjusting exposure and contrast, but the differences persisted. The original 6 faces remained the same, yet the seventh shadow shifted slightly between exposures, suggesting movement or perhaps a manipulation of time captured unknowingly by the photographer. Questions swirled. Was this figure a family member unknown to the records? A stranger who had lingered in the woods unnoticed? Or something far more sinister, an entity bound to the forest and the Hartleys, appearing only to the lens? As the historian delved into historical records, nothing corroborated the presence of a seventh person. No census, no birth record, no rumor from neighbors mentioned anyone beyond the known family. Yet the photograph did not lie. Its silent assertion was unmistakable. Something had been with the Hartleys that day, hidden but observant, and it had remained long after the shutter clicked. The historian began to realize that the existence of this shadowy seventh figure was not merely a curiosity or a mistake of development. It was a clue, perhaps the key to understanding the family's disappearance, and it suggested that whatever had been present during that session in 1941 had a reach far beyond the frame, a presence that lingered unseen, tethered to both the forest and the fate of the Hartley family. The old map, yellowed and brittle at the edges, was discovered tucked between the pages of the photographer's diary, its ink faded but still legible. It depicted the land surrounding the Hartley residence with an almost obsessive precision, marking every ridge, stream, and stand of trees, but what caught the historian's attention was a narrow, unmarked trail leading deep into the forest behind the house. The path was not part of any contemporary roads or property records, and it seemed to have been deliberately omitted from maps of the town. Its route twisted and curved unnaturally, weaving through dense clusters of trees as though avoiding detection, ending at a small clearing that was annotated only with the symbol of a square cabin. The historian traced the lines with a finger, feeling the tension that seemed to radiate from the page, a subtle insistence that this trail had significance beyond the mere layout of the land. It was not just a path through the forest, it was a thread leading into the heart of the mystery, the very ground where the Hartleys had vanished. Compelled by a mixture of curiosity and unease, the historian decided to follow the trail, taking the map into the forest one late afternoon. The woods were thick, the sunlight filtering through the branches in narrow beams, casting long shadows that twisted and shimmered across the ground. The trail itself was faint at first, almost hidden beneath fallen leaves and brambles, but as the historian progressed, the outline became clearer, as if the forest itself was guiding them forward. The air grew colder, heavier, and the sense of being watched became undeniable. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded amplified, and the historian could not shake the feeling that the trail was alive, responding to their presence. Small anomalies appeared along the path, footprints that seemed to vanish abruptly, patches of earth unnaturally flattened, and broken branches that suggested someone or something had moved through here not long ago. Hours passed, though time seemed distorted under the dense canopy, and the historian finally reached the clearing marked on the map. There, amidst overgrown weeds and the remnants of a collapsed foundation, lay the ruins of a small cabin. Charred fragments of wood were scattered across the ground, hinting at a fire long extinguished, yet the air retained a faint, acrid scent that lingered unnervingly. The historian noticed small personal items half buried in dirt, fragments of toys, a rusted buckle, a child's shoe that seemed to confirm the presence of the Hartleys. But no bodies, no signs of life, only echoes of what had once existed. The trail, the map, and the ruins together painted a picture of deliberate concealment, a path chosen to hide something horrific from the world. And as the historian surveyed the clearing, the feeling grew that the forest had been waiting all this time, patient and watchful, for anyone who might dare follow the narrow, unmarked trail to discover the secrets it had long kept hidden. The cabin ruins were more disturbing than the historian had imagined, a hollow testament to a life abruptly ended. The remnants of charred wood were scattered across the clearing like the skeleton of a building that had once stood firm against the elements, and the blackened beams jutted from the ground at odd angles, warped and splintered by fire. The forest seemed to press inward around the ruins, branches clawing at the edges of the clearing, as though trying to reclaim the space that had been violated by human curiosity. Each step the historian took stirred ash and dust, sending a faint metallic tang into the air, and with every movement, a sense of something unseen lingering nearby grew heavier, almost tangible. Among the scattered fragments, small personal belongings were partially buried in the soil, fragments of a wooden chair, pieces of ceramic plates, the rusted clasp of a child's toy box. These items confirmed the cabin had been lived in, yet their haphazard scattering suggested a violence that had left no survivors. The historian moved carefully, examining the ruins, noting details that hinted at the life that had existed there and the chaos that had ended it. A scorched table lay in fragments, its legs charred and broken, the top split into jagged shards. Burned remnants of bedding hinted at hurried attempts to escape a blaze, though the precise origin of the fire was unclear. The walls were little more than stumps of timber, their blackened surfaces etched with cracks, and the surrounding ground bore signs of disturbance, footprints pressed into mud that had since hardened, indentations that suggested someone had dragged objects, or perhaps a body, across the clearing. There was a smell that lingered, faint but unmistakable, a mix of smoke and something more organic, decaying slowly into the soil. As the historian continued through the ruins, they noticed subtle signs of human presence beyond the household, small etchings on the remnants of a window frame, lines scratched into the wood that resembled letters or numbers, as if someone had tried to leave a message in the final moments. It was impossible to decipher fully, but the effort alone suggested fear, desperation, and a consciousness aware of an imminent end. There were no remains of the Hartley family themselves, nothing to indicate the precise manner of their disappearance, only these scattered fragments and the oppressive silence of the forest. Each object seemed imbued with memory, with the echo of lives snuffed out too quickly for anyone to grieve properly. Standing in the center of the clearing, the historian felt the weight of the cabin's history pressing down, a sense that the ruins were not merely abandoned but intentionally hidden, a carefully orchestrated erasure. The forest around them seemed to lean closer, whispering with a quiet menace, as though it had watched the events unfold decades earlier and had waited patiently for someone to uncover the ruins, to recognize the scale of what had happened, and to understand that the Hartleys' disappearance had not been an accident. The charred remains, the personal artifacts, and the silence combined to tell a story of terror, one that spoke louder than any record, suggesting that the cabin had been the last place the Hartleys had touched, and that something in the forest had ensured they would never leave it alive. As the sun dipped low behind the dense canopy of pines, the forest around the cabin seemed to shift, shadows stretching unnaturally across the clearing and the ruins, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer to watch. The historian had lingered long after daylight had begun to fade, compelled by a need to understand the events that had swallowed the Hartley family decades earlier. It was then, as the final rays of sunlight filtered through the branches, that the first sounds reached them. Faint, almost imperceptible, a series of soft cries carried on the wind. At first, they were unsure whether it was the rustling of leaves, the groan of old timber, or imagination bending the natural sounds of the forest to fit the horrors they had uncovered. But as the moments stretched, the cries sharpened into something distinct, the high-pitched wails of children, small voices calling out in confusion and fear, echoing as if bouncing between the trunks in a rhythm that made the historian's stomach tighten. The sound was not constant, only appearing in irregular intervals, sometimes near the edge of the clearing, sometimes seemingly right behind them, yet when the historian spun to look, the forest was empty. The cries seemed to carry with them a weight of memory, an echo from the past that had settled into the trees, lingering like smoke from a fire long extinguished. The historian realized, with a cold certainty, that the voices matched the ages of the Hartley children as they had appeared in the photographs, a mixture of infantile wails, plaintive calls, and soft sobs, each one layered atop the other in a chorus that no living person could have produced. There was a rhythmic pattern to it, as if the cries were replaying the moments of terror the children had experienced, a looping remembrance of the final hours that had been sealed away with the forest. With each new cry, a tangible sense of dread pressed down upon the historian, heavier than the twilight air, as if the forest itself were aware of their intrusion. The whispers and murmurs seemed to swirl, converging in a place just beyond sight, and the shadows between the trees thickened unnaturally, forming shapes that could almost be human. The historian felt a pull, an involuntary urge to follow the sound deeper into the woods, toward the origin of the cries, yet an instinctive fear warned them against stepping further into that darkness. Every instinct screamed that the forest had preserved something terrible, that these voices were not merely echoes but a warning, a signal of presence and memory that had never faded. The cries continued long after the last glimmers of sunlight vanished, fading into the night while leaving an oppressive awareness in their wake. It became clear that the forest was not empty, that it held more than ruins and memories. It held the lingering essence of those who had vanished, and perhaps, something else that had caused their disappearance. The historian understood with a chilling clarity that the Hartley children had not simply been lost to time, and that the cries were not only a lament but a manifestation of the forest's enduring, watchful secret. The photograph, once static and familiar, began to reveal changes that defied all logic. At first, the historian thought it was a trick of the eyes, a subtle illusion caused by the way the light fell across the screen or the wear on the negative itself. But with each passing day, the background of the forest in the image seemed to sharpen, the blur that had once been a vague shadow taking on a more defined shape. It was almost imperceptible at first, the edges of the figure becoming slightly straighter, the posture more deliberate, the outline of a head more distinct against the dark pines. The historian stared at the photograph for hours, adjusting brightness, contrast, even magnification, trying to convince themselves that the changes were natural, the result of technological enhancements or human error. But the alterations persisted. Each day brought subtle but undeniable differences. The figure that had lingered behind the Hartleys in 1941 seemed to lean forward slightly, its presence more insistent, as though it was stepping closer to the foreground, bridging decades in a single, impossible movement. The historian began to notice details previously obscured, a faint glint where an eye might have been, the suggestion of an arm partially extended, shadows folding around the figure unnaturally, as if it were not bound by the laws of the physical world. The surrounding trees, too, seemed altered in the image, their shapes bending slightly, shadows pooling in ways that accentuated the figure's form. Every adjustment revealed more, and with each revelation, the historian's unease grew, a knot of fear tightening in the pit of their stomach. Attempts to rationalize the changes were futile. The negative had been preserved carefully, stored in conditions that should have prevented degradation. There was no sign of tampering, no digital alteration, nothing that could account for the subtle but undeniable evolution of the shadow. It was as if the photograph were alive, responding to the historian's gaze, or worse, to something beyond the room entirely. Each time they looked, the figure seemed to assert itself a little more, stepping incrementally out of the forest, into the space the Hartleys once occupied, yet never fully emerging, as though the image were a threshold between two realities. The effect on the historian was profound. Sleep became restless, filled with dreams of pines and whispers, the blurred shape of the figure pressing against their mind even when their eyes were closed. In daylight, they found themselves glancing at windows and dark corners, convinced that the figure had followed them out of the photograph. It was no longer a passive image, it demanded attention, recognition, and understanding. The historian realized that the photograph had captured more than the Hartley's likeness or the eerie stillness of a 1941 forest. It had trapped something in the frame, and over time, that something was stepping closer, as if preparing for a presence far beyond the edges of the photograph itself. The night the freshly printed photograph appeared on the historian's doorstep was unlike any they had experienced before. The envelope had no return address, no indication of who might have delivered it, and yet the photograph inside was unmistakable. The same Hartley family, posed stiffly before the forest of pines, the familiar 6 faces staring into the lens. At first, relief washed over the historian. They had assumed that the image on the restored negative had been the final, unchanging record of a vanished family. But as they studied the print, a cold dread gripped them. The 7th figure, the shadowy presence that had lingered behind the Hartleys in the older negative, was no longer confined to the background. It now stood unmistakably behind the family, closer, more defined, a looming shape that seemed to observe not just the family, but the person holding the photograph. The posture was deliberate, almost sentient, its presence asserting itself in a way that transcended the limitations of paper and ink. The historian's fingers trembled as they held the print, the air around them feeling suddenly heavier, as if the room itself were aware of the figure behind the family. Shadows seemed to shift along the edges of the walls, and the faint creak of the floorboards made them flinch. It was as if the photograph had not merely recorded the past, but had reached forward, bridging the decades to touch the present. The seventh figure, once a blur, now had a presence that was undeniable, its outline sharper, its form unmistakably humanoid, yet unnervingly alien in its stillness. Every detail suggested awareness, as if the figure had waited all these years, patient and silent, and had finally stepped into the frame with purpose. Questions flooded the historian's mind, unanswerable and terrifying. How had the photograph arrived? Who or what had sent it? And most importantly, why now? The sense of being watched intensified, a pressure that pressed against the back of the neck and the chest, urging the historian to confront the truth they had long tried to skirt. The forest had not released its hold on the Hartleys, and the entity that had claimed them had followed through time to ensure that its presence remained known. The forest, the cabin, the vanished family, and the shifting photograph were no longer separate pieces of history. They were an active force, reaching out from a past that refused to stay buried. Every instinct screamed to dispose of the print, to deny its reality, yet the historian could not tear their eyes away. The figure's presence in the photograph was undeniable, a silent assertion that the events of 1941 had never truly ended, that the disappearance of the Hartleys had not been confined to a single week in June. And as the historian stood in the dim light of their study, staring at the figure that had stepped forward from the shadows of history, a terrifying certainty settled over them. Whatever had been lurking behind the Hartleys all those years ago had found a way to cross the distance between the photograph and the present, and it had made its attention unmistakably known.